next time they shine your light in the sky, don't go to it. The bat is dead. Bury it. Consider this mercy.
Tell me. Do you bleed? You will.
And welcome to another edition of my reaction stream for AI for Lunch. This is for episode 6 of Doc Ligot's webinar, and it's about AI for social impact. And yes, without further ado, I present to you the video of last Saturday's stream. Let's wait for the episode to start.
All right, welcome. We'll start in 1 minute. Just allow people to come in.
I practically attended this webinar
It's
last
amazing how
Saturday
much of a habit this
on
webinar
Zoom.
has become. This is already the 7th webinar we've done. So thank you for those who have been supporting and faithfully registering. Ang ko, meron tayong mga regular viewers. And then for the others who won't catch this live, this thing is currently being live streamed on Facebook and will be uploaded on YouTube within the day. So thank you very much. I can see Lal in the audience. Hi, Lal.
Yeah.
So Lal actually maintains a YouTube channel of his own where he reacts to these webinars. So ayan, you can now react live, mamaya Lal,
Yeah.
if you want. All right, sige, let's kick it off. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is AI for Lunch, episode 6. Actually, the 7th webinar we've done over the past 2 months. And this episode will be about social impact, which may or may not be a term that people are used to, but it's very close to my heart. So before I start, for those of you watching live or on Facebook who don't know me, my name is Doc Ligot.
Thanks for the shout out.
I'm an
Doc.
entrepreneur, a data analyst. Started coding at the age of 6. That was my home computer on the image on the left. Pretty much just for fun. And then, of course, that kind of damaged me too much. So now I'm deep into technology. I spent the better part of my career, at least 14 years in financial services. So that's a picture of me in banking. And then the latter, I'd say 10 or so years and counting have been in IT. And the past 7 years of that as an entrepreneur. So this is the 7th webinar, but we call it episode 6 because we started with 0, called AI for Lunch. I've been doing this for 2 months with the same intentions. I wanted to spread broad awareness of AI to the public because it seems, and that's so far so good, still the case, at least in the Philippines, there doesn't seem to be a lot of people talking about AI. So I wanted to kick that off, and hopefully more and more people will start talking about it openly because it's not really an easy topic to absorb. But the way I format these webinars is I target it equally to technical and non-technical audiences. Although over time we might get a bit more technical as people are getting used to it. Pero I intend these sessions to be very accessible, even if you don't have a background in artificial intelligence or data, you should be able to understand it. I also want to address the alarmist claims about AI. There's a lot of doom and gloom, And for this episode, it's going to be about mostly hope. Papanangga natin from the prior episodes na puro doomsaying. But it's also just a high level view, no? So most of the material here, I've taken the effort of putting references, but I also freely intermix my personal views, so just be aware of that. Everything is public and open source. You can share it to anyone you want. Those who will fill up the evaluation form can get a copy of the slide deck, which you can also share or use in your own discussions. And I definitely welcome feedback on the series, no? And ideas for future sessions. Okay, so I don't think we can get away with a discussion on social impact without mentioning the SDGs. No? So what are the SDGs? So for those of you who don't know, the Sustainable
SDGs,
Development Goals,
uh,
these are
Sustainable
high-level
Development
goals
Goals.
agreed to by the United Nations and its member countries back in 2015. So these were crafted in 2015 as a way of giving a roadmap for prosperity and social good for the entire Earth, for everyone who lives on Earth. And this is actually a reboot of an earlier set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals. And long story short, they rebooted it because as of 2015, the world was not going to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So what they did
Oh,
was move the deadline to 2030, which is just 7 years from now, and then expand the list. The original MDGs, I think, parang ilan lang yun maybe no more than five, but or less than 10. This is 17 goals, and it looks very broad and diverse. Actually, it covers pretty much everything I think should be covered. So if you're the type of person who wants goodwill towards everyone in the world, social justice, for sure your concerns fall within one or several of these buckets. Now, as a data person, this actually is quite difficult for me to absorb because there are just so many and they overlap. So for this is just for me internally because I run a social impact company. What we did was group them together into kind of smaller buckets, but are easier to categorize.
all
No?
right.
It doesn't mean that these are really the goals. This is just a shorthand that we adopt, and you can see there are boxes that repeat, no?
Human
Like
rights,
education
human
repeats a lot, poverty
well-being,
repeats a lot. But
smart
for us
societies,
in my companies,
economic
it's just simpler to
development,
think of it this way.
clean
So at any
environment.
given point, if you're trying to do social good, you're probably doing one of these five. No, you're either fighting for human rights, which covers everything from equality, gender, peace, justice, poverty. Or you're fighting for human well-being, examining well-being, kind of the quality of life of people. So everything from hunger to health, sanitation, education, or you're fighting for the future, like smart societies, no? Everything from renewable energy, infrastructure, sustainability, uh, or you're fighting for a better economic development, which I think is kind of all encompassing, everything from jobs to removing poverty, of course, educating everyone, and finally everything related to the environment. So all the climate action, water, land, recycling, consumption. So ganon, no? All these five. So as if you notice, this was also the questionnaire I provided in the registration as a good way of screening just what people are concerned about. So often I start my webinars like this, no? Just a profile of everyone who registered. This is by no means kind of a significant survey that reflects everyone in the Philippines, but it's good as an indication. No? So everyone who registered for this webinar at least, easily half are concerned with economics, which doesn't come as a surprise. I guess if you're coming from a quote unquote normal background, meaning you probably work in a for-profit institution or like just like everyone, you want to earn money, retire. Economics is probably at the top of your head. And then to a lesser extent, all these other things. No, second would be everyone's gunning for smarter societies. So especially if you're a tech person, you probably fall in this category. And then everything else is kind of the fringe. No, human rights, well-being. I was surprised that climate didn't even come up. No, and that's for me an interesting
LOL.
perspective. Climate risks are big risks. We hear about it a lot, but it's not top of mind for everyone. It's not something. Well, that's what I would conclude. It's not something that bothers you. You don't wake up every day thinking of global warming, for example. And that's an interesting thing to think about if you're interested in climate action. You really have to find a way to put it top of mind. And we can talk about that. How do you use data for that? Another chart I want to show you is this. So this crosses the industries where people come from. Again, this is just the registration and what they're worried about. I mean, obviously, everyone is worried about economics, the tech people, and the education people, especially, interestingly. But human rights only popped up for those working in agriculture, health, and government. I guess it makes sense because you're also looking at
Doesn't make sense,
poverty, I guess.
actually.
Same thing for human well-being. It's only the health, agri, and government
Making
people who flag
everyone
that.
seems
Uh,
to be
Smart societies,
apathetic,
about
right?
equally sa tech people, health, agri, government, and call centers. Interestingly, the outsourcing people mentioned this. So maybe this is also reflective of either the concerns or
So,
the hopes about how AI will affect outsourcing. So it's interesting if you look at it this way. So not everyone is concerned about the same thing, even if you aggregate everyone together. It depends on where your background is. That's also food for thought. If you're the type of person who wants to get into social impact, either through your employer or as a person, uh, this is an indicator that you have to choose your battles. No? You have to choose where to preach to. So more on that later. Okay, so let's get to the bulk of it. So I'll divide this. This will be a little bit under an hour, I think. There's a lot of material I want to show you. A lot of it comes from the work that I actually have done as examples. So you get inspired on thinking about AI for social impact. Again, I'll start with what's happened in the generative AI space so far. Then I want to dive really into what is social impact, design patterns. When you say design patterns, how do you go about dissecting a social problem through the lens of AI, no, and data? And you'll find a lot of, hopefully you'll find a lot of useful frameworks. Then I'll dive into several social impact projects we have done in the recent 3 years. We spent most of the pandemic actually working for humanitarian agencies such as WHO, UNDP, USAID, really interesting projects that you will probably never, I mean, I would never get to do these projects again unless another crisis struck. So it was very instructive. So I hope to be able to process those projects, share it with you as a way of birthing more of them. Because the problem with these social impact projects, they highly depend on funders and donors. It's not something people do regularly. So we basically
basically
made a
tax
career of it in the
write-offs,
past few years.
if
But
you
now,
consider it.
admittedly, funding is starting to dry up, especially around COVID-19. But there are still other problems and other funding that can be had. So this could be an idea generator for those of you who want to bring a data career or an AI career into social impact. And then, as always, I want to talk a little bit about the ethics of it. There's a little bit of concern I have, having dealt with big and small NGOs, corporate foundations. It's an interesting, I would say,
Personally, I
bias
think
that's worth talking about. I mean,
ethics
it's not a
is
deal breaker, but it's
important.
good to be aware of these moral hazards, as I call them. Okay, let's start. This is a familiar slide for those of you watching. The big story in the past 6 months has been the emergence of generative AI. But that doesn't mean AI hasn't been used in the past. Actually, AI has been quite, I would say, pervasive in the past. It's just not as pervasive as generative AI. Most of the AI being used in the past is what I would call discriminative AI. This is AI that interprets data. So you give it pictures of a cat, it tells you if it's a cat or not. While the generative space is all about generating more data. So that's the difference. I'll give you a picture of a cat, give me more cats. I'll give you a prompt of a cat, you give me a cat. And this is the divide I'm seeing with these two types of AI. AI for the longest time is more something that gives you ideas or perception, no? Something that helps you interpret things. While the new AI or the generative AI space has been more about creativity or creation, no? Content creation, content curation. So all of these AI tools that people are getting exposed to, image generators, chatbots, they're really best used as idea generation machines, if you ask me. You can ask, so don't ask it to write a paper for you, but you can probably ask it to give you ideas for papers you can write. That's what I'm saying. And I think this will have a massive implication when we talk about applications, no, of generative AI. Okay, so let's get to it. First, social impact. What is social impact ba talaga? No? And
Interesting.
it's one of these
Social impact.
terms that you hear about. Some new and old terms are related to it. Like you might be familiar with CSR. You know, that's the corporate term for it, corporate social responsibility. So the context there is companies don't just want to show that they're not just about making money, but they also are about giving money back. So yeah, may CSR ka dyan. Especially if you're
That's
in a highly contentious industry like tobacco. No, there's for the longest time, tobacco companies denied that lung cancer was linked to tobacco use. No, they tried to suppress that. Then nung lumabas na, tobacco companies are now all about funding research to stop
of
cancer,
course they
lung
would
cancer, and also research to what we
people
call
still
harm reduction.
use
Because there are a lot of people who are
tobacco
addicted to
and
tobacco. That's a social issue, but they make money off of that addiction. So
people
now they're
still
funding
smoke.
research on how to either curb that addiction or get people to, you know, keep their addiction without harming their lives. No? I think at some point, companies like the social media companies should be doing something like that because social media is also addictive. Okay, so I want to attack the social impact lens from a different way. No? Some of you might have seen this diagram I showed in other talks. This is called the value pyramid. It was coined by Bain, which is a consulting company. It's based roughly around the Maslow's hierarchy, if you remember that from school. So this is from the perspective of creating products. We're going to create products or services. These are the things that people derive value from. The lowest value is functional. So this is the most familiar to people. So when you buy something or you subscribe to something, these are the things you look for. You know, what kind of value do you get from it? Does it reduce your risk? Does it make money for you? Does it reduce cost? These are things products are made of. So by default, if you satisfy any of these, you could have a viable product or service. But not all services are made equal. Some services go beyond
It's
that
true.
functional level into emotional level. And the best example I can think of here is Apple. I'm not an Apple customer, but I'm a big admirer of how they market their stuff. So let's say the difference between an iPhone and an
iPhone.
Android. People who have iPhones love their iPhones far more than the people who have Androids. And the reason for that is kind of intangible things, no? Like aesthetics, design, therapeutic value, or medyo
Or
may status assigned to it.
status.
So these are
Yes.
emotional levels of value. They're not necessarily like the tangible value you buy immediately. They're like intangible value or luxury goods for that matter. So nakita nyo na yung big difference. The people who have emotional attachment to products and services are notch. These
Status
services
quo.
are a notch higher than the usual, you know, run-of-the-mill services. So what's at the highest point of this pyramid then? No? And this is what opened my eyes to it way back. I saw this also in 2015. I was still working in IT then. Things that change your life are big. So if you go through, you know, a memorable experience, for example, for those of you who got married, that's a very memorable experience for you, no? So yung wedding planner deals with life-changing things, so, like events or yung mga gumagawa ng debut. So
Yeah.
life-changing is all about motivation, affiliation, self-actualization, hope. So that's really at the highest level of value. And then at the very peak of it, I found this interesting, is social impact, meaning the most value you can probably experience is if you can do something that affects the world, society at large positively. And this is, I think, the deepest. I know this. I used to work in banking, no, the most money-making industry alive, and then now I'm doing data for social good. It's a very big difference. Kasi you're not counting your achievement just in like dollars or return on investment. You're counting it in terms of how many people you've helped, how many people you've impacted. And it's very hard to get to that point. I'm not even saying I'm not that point, but that's what I aim for. No? So that's a clue of what we're talking about for the rest of the hour. I also like this definition. Social impact is the effect on people and communities that happen as a result of an action or inaction. So you can also have a positive or a negative social impact, is what I'm getting here. And some people
Yeah.
don't realize that they have a negative social impact. That's another clue in the right direction. It still feels a bit
Some
vague
people are
at this
clueless.
point. So I'm going to share with you two important pieces of research that I encountered regarding social impact. It's important because it becomes very specific after you've read them. One paper is this titled, "How Researchers Approach Social Impact." I'll share the links in the description during the Q&A. No? It's by Fechter and Hebbing, and it looks at how areas of research, no, areas of science like humanities, social science, natural science, and how much impact do they do in this parang radar diagram, no, of
Yeah.
things that happen.
This
And if
radar
you look
chart
closely at them,
is
for example, here's a task:
dope.
politics and public discourse. Does it support legislation? Does it contribute to political decisions? Does it stimulate public discourse? That's interesting. Or dito sa culture, does it preserve cultural heritage or contribute to education? Or if you go below, does it drive innovation? So nasa economics na tayo, or contribute to economic growth? Or in the environment, does it protect biodiversity or contribute to the well-being of people? And this is something interesting. I hardly think of this, pero importante to. Does it strengthen disadvantaged groups? Or does it improve processes in organizations? Sometimes that's often neglected. A lot of NGOs I've met, no disrespect, are highly inefficient, highly manual, paper-based, and they're supposed to be the ones solving,
Paper
for all
based.
societal good. While you have, for-profit corporations with all of their IT, their infrastructure, and all they're doing is just making money. It's a very lopsided situation.
Lopsided.
So I like this
Yes.
graph kasi it's a very, very specific and prescriptive parang list of things that allow you to define, am I making a social impact? Is my company making a social impact? So run through this checklist and find out how many of these things do you really do. Like, for example, in my own attempt to do AI webinars, my first hope is to stimulate public discourse about AI.
Mhm.
And hopefully this becomes an input into the lawmakers who are trying to come up with regulations. I can hope, but I have other avenues to do that. For example, through AAP, which I helped found, or dealing with specific NGOs. Sana makarating. But that's the point. When you start talking social impact, it's not just about the financial component. Certainly, that's important. You now have to think about what change in society did you really do. And I found this research quite useful. Another example is this research nakalagay dito, towards societal impact through open research. Research is kind of the proxy, no? But pretend this means you. And what they did is they look at various fields of academics: biology, medicine, STEM, environmental, etc. And then they said, what kind of impact does your research do? Parang survey siya among academics. And the fun part is the highest level is academics. So that's really what academics do. They help
Yes,
fellow
true.
academics, or they create more research. But then when you dive into these other aspects, does it improve public opinion? Does it improve quality of life? Does it improve health? With the exception of medicine, parang no other realm of research really makes an impact to society. And that's a good wake-up call for me, no? Not just for researchers, but for everyone in general. When you look at your career, your existence, what you do, of course, you do your job because you need to make a living. Pero beyond that, how are you able to impact all of these other things? If it's important to you, it's not important to everyone. But since we're talking about social impact, I felt this needs to be discussed so that you know where to go. Honestly, I even find some NGOs are not able to justify their existence other than the donations they receive. It's not because they don't want to, baka they just haven't thought about it enough. So I think some of these ideas
That's fishy.
can be helpful in plotting out, if
True.
you're part of an NGO or
Real
an
fishy.
organization, just exactly what your impact to society is. And then, because once you've decided on that, data and AI can then be helpful in bridging that gap. We talked about SDGs earlier. I think one thing that I find the SDGs quite useful in is giving directions, or a blueprint. Like, okay, I want to fight for gender equality. Oh, that's SDG 5. And the UN already provides ideas on where to start. Doesn't mean the UN is right, by the way. You have to also learn to think of the UN as just another input into your strategy. But certainly they've already consulted a lot of people, so you can use that and get inspired by it. Later, I'll show you some of the metrics that these SDGs amount to. It's really a massive list, but also goes to show that there's more to doing impact than just being a bleeding heart online. No? That's the motivation. You want to be angry about something or you want to promote something. But beyond that, you also have to think about how do I systemically change things for the better? And this is where what we call a TOC or a theory of change comes in. What is a theory of change? Theory of change essentially is the NGO version of vision, mission, goals for corporations, which you kind of
Mhm.
do during
Mission
annual
vision.
planning or team building. So NGOs do that too. They're actually the same thing. They're just phrased slightly differently. So, and it might also help you to think of theory of change, even if you're a for-profit organization. Because for me, it's easier, it's more clear cut as a framework compared to traditional vision, mission goals, and SWOT analyses, etc. So quite simply, a theory of change is looking at two things. One is being honest about what's happening today, and being optimistic or aggressively, ambitious to what should be or what things should be tomorrow or at some point in the future. And then if you know that, then you can start bridging the gap. If I know these are the problems today, I can think of strategies that I need to do to bridge the gap, which then translates to action. And then the impact is really the measurement of that action. And that's how you build the vision. So I'll give you an example. This is what we did when we did Project Sparta, when we did the design thinking for it. What's the current condition? For those of you who don't know what Project Sparta is, it's a nationwide training program for analytics. It ended in 2022, but it's been rebooted since by the government. And when we started to propose this to DOST, who was the funder, we said, what's the current problem? We don't have we have a lack of evidence-based policy. It's like government is just coming up with laws that aren't backed by solid research. We have a lot of public data that's
It
underutilized.
seems that
And we have government generally that struggles to
they
address the social problems,
make
despite the amount of money you throw at it. Parang wala
laws
nangyayari.
based on
So what's the strategy then if you want to fix this? Well,
them.
our vision is a vibrant, data-driven ecosystem for the Philippines. So between now and there, there's a big gap. The strategies are we want to create a data literate workforce. Because it doesn't matter if you have a lot of data if no one else knows how to use it. We want to then provide access to that public open data set easily. No? And finally, if you have the data literate workforce and you have open data, then you need to encourage evidence-based projects, meaning you have to provide the framework for people to use that data to commit to social change. So that's kind of the top three that came up. We had other ideas, but so given these three strategies, what were the actions? Sige, let's launch Project Sparta, which is an online platform. It had 30 online courses on everything from using Excel to doing an effective data-driven urban planning strategy, parang lahat, no? Then we would do open data hackathons, meaning each LGU or national government would expose their data to the Sparta audience, and then they would use the skills they learned in the online training to do these projects, and the projects become parang certificates on their CV, which can prove that they can do things, which can then help them with employment, which is an ongoing challenge pala right now. And then finally, DOST would then do a call for proposals to fund the projects that look promising, and then can either become a career na for the people who propose them or an augmentation to their livelihood. Diba? So as of the time I wrote this, we had almost 50,000 scholars. That was in 2022. And I think they're trying to push it to 100. The original goal was 300,000, by the way. So we were short. But 50,000 is not small. That's more than all of the data science and analytics programs combined in the Philippines. So certainly it would make an impact. The other two are still ongoing. Pero I think as of 2022, there were at least 3 LGUs already that did a hackathon. And there were some proposals already that's been greenlit by the UST with grants ranging from 1 million to almost 20 million, I think biggest. Because the UST has a lot of money actually, relatively. But they struggle with disbursing that money because no one can propose a decent project. That's also a clue for those of you who want to create projects. You find an interesting problem that you want to solve, you write a proposal to the UST and see if you can get funded. So that's the theory of change for Sparta. And I think by and large, it has been more successful than not. At the very least, we've given the awareness to people on how to initiate projects. and hopefully it becomes the basis for future work. No, so that's the power of a theory of change. Okay, so this next part is about what are the kind of design patterns that you can think about if you want to do data-driven change. And the way I would frame this is what we call the 4-box framework sa Zerolytics. At any given time, if you want to parang commit to a social change, or you want to make a positive impact to society with data, you're doing one of 4 things. Either you're defining the problem, you're being an activist about it, trying to attract attention, or you're doing data journalism, meaning there's some research to be done, some problems to be solved, or you're doing policy and lobbying. So you already know what to do. It's been backed by research. You want to recommend actions. Or lastly, there's already actions being done, and you want to do measurement and evaluation, monitoring and evaluation, M&E. Or you can do a combination of the 4. But this looks so deceptively simple. But to be honest, I rarely meet NGOs or activists who can really specifically articulate what they're trying to do, other than kind of the grassroots projects that they're doing. Oh, we're gonna distribute relief goods, or we're gonna do some workshops, livelihood, capacity building. Okay, yun, lahat yun. Those are actually all on the lower right hand corner. You're acting. But would that action be backed by evidence? Sometimes not. And then are you measuring the impact of that action?
I think
Probably never, because they don't have time to do
those
so, or there is no capability
research
in your
sometimes
average
are
NGO to do
from
analysis,
emotion.
even if some of them come from highly credentialed backgrounds. No disrespect. A lot of them are PhDs actually, but most of their time are spent on the upper right-hand corner, research, and that's very important. But there's more to impact than just coming up with a research paper. Actually, that's what you do at the last part of it. You do the impact first, then you write the results. And the remainder is actually an open invitation to anyone who's into data analytics, AI, even if you're not a highly credentialed anyone, but you have a passion for change. That's where you guys come in. You can fill in the blanks and then come up with a good framework. So I mentioned the SDGs earlier. So if you go to Our World in Data, this is the 232 SDG indicators.
Wow,
Dami, no?
dami.
Every SDG has, and this is already what the UN prescribes. Okay? And you can add more if you want. The whole point of this chart was the red boxes are the ones that don't have enough data, ironically. And that's, I would say, easily 40% of the list. The ones that have a lot of data are green, and then the yellow are kulang-kulang. So for example, health is quite well represented kasi nga it's usually driven by the medical profession, public health profession, and they're quite thorough about generating statistics. But if you look at what's a really bad one, ito, yung sustainable cities, it's pretty empty, which is ironic because if you want to do smart cities, the first thing you should really do is come up with smart city data. I know some people are doing it, pero it is very hard because data formats and data standards are hard to find. Look at the peace and strong institutions level. So this is anything related to corruption, disinformation, sexual violence,
Welcome
bribery.
to the Philippines, right?
I mean, these are things you definitely want to measure. But how do you measure that? No one tracks that. By definition, all of these things happen outside the radar. But these are the indicators that, siguro, when you can track how many times they're mentioned in the news. That's why journalism is still very important. And that's also why in countries that are experiencing quite questionable human rights environments, the journalists are the first to go. They're killed, they're silenced.
Welcome to the Philippines.
Stations are taken down. Kasi sila yung metrics eh. If you don't have them measuring it, then wala. But social media is still there. People can still measure, but not as effectively as if you had functioning news organizations. So the whole point of this slide is you can't get to impact if you don't know impact measurement. And that's a gap that needs to be filled by everyone. We need to come up. Sabi nga ni, I think it was Drucker, what gets measured gets managed. So if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. So one of our first goals should be is to come up with indicators. Another thing to think about, I want to share this framework that I found very useful. It's by the Joint Research Commission of the EU. It's called Inform. It's a risk-based framework, pero actually you can adapt it to anything you want. You can even adapt it to corporate work. The idea here is if you want to manage risk or an outcome, it's a combination of three things, and only one of them is measured often. It's the hazard that you want to deal with, whether it's disasters, epidemics, political risk, disinformation. Those are all hazards. But the hazard is only as effective as the people who are exposed to it, that's vulnerability, and their ability to cope. So, for example, something like COVID, the number of people with COVID, that's the hazard. But the population demographics can be vulnerable or not. So, we know that COVID was deadlier to elderly. The older you are, the more likely you could die from it. So, if you're in an area where there are mostly senior citizens, that's a highly vulnerable area. Diba? And then the coping capacity is kind of the mitigant. Does that area have health centers? Does that area have hospitals? So I wouldn't be as worried about a province that had a high concentration of health facilities and supplies, even if there were a lot of senior citizens there, as opposed to an area where there's only one hospital for every 20 kilometers. So there's not enough doctors and nurses in that location. That's what I'm saying. And Inform makes that very straightforward. So you can actually use this for anything. Like you want an offer for marketing, for example. That's the exposure. The vulnerability is how many people are predisposed to buy your product, which you can measure. And then finally, do you have infrastructure where you can actually sell or distribute the product, like your branches? So, parang ganon, you can measure any outcome using this framework. They even created a specific one for epidemics. No?
Mhm.
So Inform is an example of not necessarily just a measurement framework, but an outcome framework. So it's kind of like a theory of change. If you ask me, it's a good way of crafting your strategy. So if you were going to convert this to a theory of change, it would be find out how many people are suffering from a certain issue, find out what contributes to that suffering, and then find out what strategies or infrastructure can mitigate that suffering. And then you choose what to do. No, you either educate people or you help invest in that infrastructure. You help monitor that, and then over time it changes. Mamaya, when I go through some specific projects we've done, you'll see how this could do work for you. No? Data gathering is very important. So I want to talk briefly about data here. Most people who are in the classical research or NGO fields are only aware of the latter two, the quantitative and the qualitative data. In fact, this is a long-standing wiring area of research for some. If you're a quantitative researcher, you rely more on surveys. No? That's the quantitative
Mhm.
data. So your results are measured by statistical significance, no? By correlation, something really rigorous. While if you're a qualitative researcher, you focus more on kind of subjective data gathering, but it's still important. You organize focus group discussions, you do sentiment surveys, small scale, or you do a workshop like a SWOT workshop, a design thinking workshop, and then you document that. Now, I think where there are two areas of improvement I can suggest. One area is usually the quants and the quals, they try to do both using one method only. So if you're a quant, you prefer doing surveys,
Quant
but
and
surveys are
quals.
expensive. And a lot depends on how you craft the question. If you don't craft the question properly, then you could blow it. No? And I've seen a lot of really bad surveys being used for for bad things. The quals naman also do the opposite. They have these subjective interviews, which are good for getting drill down and context. But then they use the quals also to project outward and say, oh, I had three people say this. That means everyone says this. Of course not. No? You have to do some sort of a statistically significant survey. So yan ang war. The best approach is actually to combine both. Occasionally, you find those kinds of research. Then there's this first column, which is big data. For the longest time, and I think up to now, it's still an emerging area of parang integration. So the quants and the quals alike don't necessarily like dealing with big data. And I think that's an opportunity because big data is not as biased as I would say a survey because You can't force people to tweet something, for example. So if you're able to scrape a big enough data set from social media, you could get a fairly accurate pulse. But we have to be careful that it's not overread. No, for example, during the elections, people were trying to put Google Trends and surveys against each other. I think that was kind of a mistake.
That was a mistake.
Other areas of opportunity, not just social listening, but remote sensing, which I'll talk about earlier. This is satellite data naman. So you can see how ground conditions on the Earth change, and that can be an input into other things. Little things like CCTVs, mobility data, sensor feeds, these are very powerful. Now, of course, let's not make the same mistake as the other categories of thinking big data can then satisfy everything. The best approach talaga is to do multimodal research, data gathering, where you gather big data, quantitative, qualitative, and see how that can be done, or what they say together or against each other. So this is an example of social listening. Google Trends is obviously something everyone must have seen. And then releasing surveys, but through social media can also be useful. So again, this is kind of like a hybrid between big data and quants, no? Or scraping the social media feeds themselves. There's a lot of noise for sure. But for example, in one of the projects, mamaya I'll show you, the correlation of Google searches for dengue predicts dengue very well, no? And it's because no one would normally talk about dengue naman unless they have dengue. This is remote sensing. I think one thing that I like about today compared to maybe just 5 or 10 years ago, it was very hard to use satellite data before because you needed specialized platforms. But now you can do it on the web. Things like Google Earth Engine, Sentinel Hub, a lot of the NASA platforms, which we use a lot, they're free. If you want to get a more higher resolution data set, that's when you pay. But then you can go through DOST or ASTI for access, as long as you have government
As
a
long as you
government
have
party willing to partner with
government
you. It's free kasi for
access.
government. For commercial use, super mahal. And then finally, I want to run through this. I want to make a special mention of graph theory. Why graph theory? Graph theory is the study of networks, and we found that network analysis often has interesting insights to share when you're looking at social impact, because you can analyze how things are connected to each other. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of graph theory today. Maybe I'll reserve another episode for that. This is a very interesting area of study. But this is the science that helps you do contact tracing, for example. This is the science that helps you look at traffic flow. This is the science that helps you look at relationships between COVID cases, so you can find who the patient zero is. Ang daming opportunities for graph theory. The challenge lang with this one is, number one, it's not that popular. And number two, the data that you need to do graph theory isn't the usual tabular data, or you need to transform the data a little bit to make it useful for graphs. Again, not the time to talk about it. But if you have time to look into this, or if you're already a practitioner of graph theory, I would encourage you guys to look at it. And then last, design pattern. We're already at the 40-minute mark. I want to reserve time for questions. There's a interesting, I would say, commonality between the systems we design, because we've worked with a lot of NGOs on what do they want to do. Parang ganyan, we do some discovery with them, business requirements gathering. And we found that there are 4 general types of systems, quote unquote, or use cases that every NGO across any field seem to want to do. So I feel that that's worth sharing, para you can shortcut the ideation process na. So there are 4 types. First type is attribution. Attribution means putting a causal or correlation between what we did versus what happened. That's very important for NGOs, because that's what justifies their funding. You want to talk to your funder, maybe you're talking to the Gates Foundation or all of these mega bucks funding companies. The most powerful, compelling story you can tell them is we are able to show that because of what we did, whatever you did, education, infrastructure, distributing whatever, relief goods, you were able to change a prevailing social issue. That's very powerful. So attribution is a very powerful use case. Second is decision support. So having decision support, this is more operational. Any way that you can minimize the manual decision making. That doesn't mean you do automatic decision making, although that's possible. but anything that can help your people on the ground make split-second decisions is worth investing in. Another is planning. This is also quite popular. People want to look at, okay, this is what's happening now. What will happen 1 month from now, 2 years from now? What are the trends? What are the trajectories? What's the can we simulate outcomes, assuming you have a lot of data na? No? And that also goes hand in hand with attribution. And finally, probably the most, I would say, not necessarily mundane, pero commonly overlooked, is a monitoring system. You just want to keep counting what, how, where, how frequent, how well did we do, and then track that over time. Like in COVID, the most common statistic was the reproductive number, diba? Everyone wants to know what's the R. Kasi anything above 1, that means the disease is spreading. Anything below 1, that means the disease is already receding. So there was a lot of people calculating R using various formulas. Minsan nag-aaway pa what's the right formula. But the bottom line there is to track the progress of, let's say, an epidemic or the progress of, say, vaccination. So these are the four. So every time you're thinking about adding data to your toolkit, isipin nyo na agad exactly what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to monitor something? Are we trying to plan for something? Are we trying to automate decision making or help decision making? Parang Waze, no? Waze is a decision system, tells you where to go. Or attribution. Are we trying to prove what was the impact of what we did? Okay, sige, that was a lot of info. I want to dive into concrete examples. There's not enough time to talk about everything we've ever done, but I want to pick 3 things that might give you guys some solid ideas. They're already well documented in the news or in or online. I'm gonna drop these links mamaya sa chat and Facebook.
Project
First is Project ADs, which if you don't know, probably is my own
infodemiology
call to fame. It was a
and
NASA
vaccine
Space Apps
acceptance.
project that's now a UNICEF Innovation Fund project. It's about dengue. Then we did some work with Facebook to track fake news, no, using epidemic methods. It's interesting. And then finally, we spent most of 2021 working with the UNDP and the WHO on helping the DOH craft communication strategies for vaccinations. And our input here was more on campaign design, but you might find it interesting how we went about it because it has to do with pretty much any social impact you would like to profile people you want to influence. No? So first, Project ADs, briefly. Well, we had dengue in 2019 before we had COVID. And the way we reasoned it was the most important vector to track was mosquitoes. And then you had the data from DOH, which was about 2 to 3 months late. So now the idea
Two to
was,
three
could
months
we
late.
find a way to connect the dengue trend with data that we could already track every day? And if we can find some sort of a relationship, then we can have a daily tracker for dengue. Ganun lang naman yun.
Yes.
The use case was twofold. We had satellite data and we had social media data. And with social media and Google specifically, we could already track where people were searching for dengue, talking about dengue, where the panic was happening. So this was the snapshot back in 2019. Actually, if you look closely, there's an interesting seasonality to it. Like every time November, June, parang ganyan. I don't know now if the pattern is the same. So there's a seasonality to the dengue epidemic. And we chose 3 areas to focus on based on that data.
The mosquito.
Then we looked at climate data, like weather data from Pag-asa and the Google Trends, and we found that it actually matches the dengue,
It's the
the
mosquito
actual dengue
season.
trend close enough. So now we could say where people were panicking, and we could say potentially when people are getting sick. The question na lang is, what do you do? And here we used research on establishing mosquito-rich areas on the ground using remote sensing. So we would determine based on recent satellite cover maps, we would know, this particular area pala is highly likely to have a lot of mosquitoes. And if it's a specific kind of mosquito called the Aedes aegypti, which has a certain type of habitat and a certain type of incubation cycle, you could now tell the health center, oi, maybe you can go to these areas. Potentially there could be mosquitoes there, and then you intervene by inoculating the area. You can do some misting, or I don't know what you want to do. There were several people we talked to about what are the possible ways of stopping mosquito spread. And then we opened the platform to a community. So a lot of people did their own version of it. We're actually now on like the 5th iteration. It's already a digital public good, which we registered. Now the good thing about this, there's this is actually a mixed story. No, there's a good and the bad. The bad thing about what happened here was, honestly, DOH wasn't interested. No, they'd rather stick to traditional health surveillance. So it's still an ongoing
Okay.
uphill battle for us. And the reason for this is straightforward, no? Especially if there are any doctors or public health people listening. The public health and clinical health fields are always at war with each other. That's a traditional problem. I didn't know that. My brother actually is a medical doctor, so he told me as much. The clinical people, they deal with hospitals or health centers. So their area of intervention is when everyone got sick na. So making people get well more efficiently, that's their intervention. While the public health people look at everything else, no? What's the environment like? What are the support structures like? And the indicators they look at are beyond the hospital. No? And this kind of intervention, the satellite data, the social media, fits more closely to public health. But to be honest, the people running DOH are more clinical health related. They'd rather see people
Yeah.
come to the hospital first and die before they declare an epidemic. That's really the truth. But on the other hand, this is the good news, naman. Using the same technology, we were able to invade or influence other areas. So after dengue, COVID became a big deal. So we got very involved there in COVID tracking, epidemic indicators. We also got into food security with the World Food Program and other and UNICEF. Kasi one of the first things that was affected by lockdowns is the food supply. No? So let's try tracking that. And then also looking at doing risk maps of the country, which can easily be adopted to any type of issue. No? If you can do risk maps of food, you can also do risk maps of uh, abuse, no? which was a human rights issue. We actually did a human rights project for the USAID, looking at COVID, pero more of mentions of human rights abuses during lockdowns. And that piece of study should be another episode, actually, the human rights part. We actually did two more NASA Space Apps challenges and won them. Project Gideon was the adoption of ABs to COVID. Heartbeat naman is on more global health issues like tuberculosis, respiratory diseases, etc. Same approach. Gideon actually won in 2021, so that was our second win. No? This is the human rights dashboard that I mentioned. Again, I don't have enough time to talk through it in detail, but basically looking at what was the human rights situation across social media through through the lockdowns. And makikita mo, every time there's an ECQ or a GCQ, if you remember those terms, there was a spike in human rights mentions. And why was that?
Yeah. Why
For
was
some
that?
reason.
For some
The most
reason.
recent initiative we did for NASA, this is actually for NASA and ESA, was looking at air quality naman. The idea there was you can get air quality data from satellites and then you can bash that with mobility data from Google, which sadly isn't available anymore. And then you can tell
Sayang.
where mobility was coming back, but also pollution, no? And then do a ratio of mobility and pollution to tell you whether a particular area was relatively clean or dirty. Kasi nga, nung nag-lockdown, everyone stopped driving. The air was so clean. But then when the lockdowns were lifted, suddenly people are back on the roads with a vengeance, but not equally. Some areas remained relatively clean compared to others. So this mobility and air quality index was an attempt to measure that. We call it Maki. And here's the fun part: if you calculated the Maki rate over time, it actually predicted COVID also with a high degree of
Wow. That's
statistical
cool.
significance. So that was interesting. And then later, literature na lang basically indicated the reason na a high CO2 concentration pala was a vector in spreading the COVID virus airborne. And for the longest time, even the WHO denied that COVID could be
Was
spread through the
airborne.
air. No? They said it's particles on surfaces, kaya you should always sanitize everything you touch. Yung pala, just sitting in the same room with someone with COVID can get you sick. But depending on the CO2 concentration. So we didn't know that. Pero when we did this piece of work, yung pala yun, no? We were detecting already the evidence
Depends
for
on
it.
the CO2
Okay, project number 2,
concentration.
infodemics. I'll speed through this quickly kasi paus na yung oras. I want to get to Q&A soon. So the idea here was during COVID-19, there's a lot of fake news. No? Like for example, if you heard of Tuob, this is the fake news that you could use steam inhalation to solve
Obis
COVID. It was
Visayas.
popularized
When you
by
go up to
certain
Luzon,
governor in
it's
Cebu.
ob.
And you had
The
these
difference
Facebook
between S
pages,
and
some
T.
of them by legitimate doctors,
All.
also spreading the news. So we said, okay, this sounds like a measurable disinformation because you can extract the engagement from these pages. So if we can get engagement, could we calculate some sort of a reproductive number also from it? And the answer is yes. So using that as a theory, we extracted mentions, but not in the Philippines, because I'm sure we would have been canceled if we did it. But we did it in Brazil. And we found that you could calculate the relative virality index using the same method as calculating for reproductive number for COVID. And then use that as a way of differentiating mga strains of disinformation. So parang you're approaching disinformation like a virus because it does spread like a virus. And then if you can isolate certain strains, kasi once you know, this strain seems to be very no, parang infectious, then we can see sino ba nag-spread niyan, who spread these strains of news. And we applied that um, parang basis to do contact tracing. So ito yung sinasabi ko about networks. If you know who's parang sharing a particular series of phrases or words or posts, you can now trace that back in time and you can find out who the super spreader was, who was patient zero, sino ba yung nagpakana niyan, and who are the multiple carriers. Because oddly enough, there are what do you call this? There are pages that are prone to spreading disinformation, or baka naman they're really designed to do it. And then the last part of this research was applying naman concepts in virology and genetics to measure the mutation of a topic. So instead of looking at changes in proteins, mga protein markers, no, if you're into that, we use text and phrases and measured the changes of that. So you can have a strain of disinformation emanating from this page that starts out like, oh, COVID is a bioweapon. And then later, there's a lot of fake news about COVID has HIV. And then later naging, vaccines don't work. Oh no, people want to control population because they're they're using vaccines to kill people. It was the same people spreading the exact same the same series of misinformation, but the posts were changing. So if you know how to measure that, you can now track what kind of disinformation could happen in the future. This is where generative AI could actually help. Lastly, 4 minutes to go. In 2021, we worked with UNDP on analyzing the reason why vaccinations weren't accelerating as fast as the government wanted. No? And we got data from a Facebook survey. Basically, these are regions in the Philippines plotted out against how many are vaccinated and how many are hesitant. Kasi may question again, would you like to be vaccinated, yes or no? So you have regions that are highly vaccinated and are not hesitant. And then on the extreme opposite, people who are not vaccinated and are highly hesitant. And then you have these weird parang aberrations. No? There are people who said they were hesitant, but they were getting vaccinated anyway.
Yeah.
And there were people who are saying they're not hesitant, pero parang kulang. And so the reasons differ, no, between the four. And that was the start of it. And the outcome was something like this. So we used data from Pulse Asia and social media, combined them into one data set, and did some clustering and unsupervised learning to unearth 7 types of profiles. And the idea here is the framework that we used was called diffusion of innovation, which is in communication theory and social science. The idea here is for any change you want to do, there's at least 5 groups of people. You have the early adopters and the innovators. Sila yung nagkakasundo. The innovators invent it and the early adopters believe it. Bili agad. But then to get to early majority, which is mass acceptance, you have to cross this thing called a chasm. And the idea there is the motivations of the early adopters and innovators are different from the majority, the early majority. So now you have to address not just availability of vaccines, you want to address distrust in the government, you want to address fears of fatalities, mga ganong type of issues. And then the late majority and the laggards, they'll just move when everyone else has moved. So that helped us craft messaging for DOH. Kasi honestly, at that point in time, DOH was just addressing the early adopters. Parang people who knew vaccinations were safe and knew that you had to do it, sila lang yung nagpapabakuna. Pero the ones that were a bit more parang skeptical, pero willing pa rin, they needed a different kind of communications message. And then of course, you would generally ignore the skeptics who are noisy and focus on the quiet, the movable middle as they called it. And then that's how we group the regions accordingly. Okay, so to summarize, the point I want to make with this section before we close is doing data for social impact has pros and cons. Number one, the con is you have to be naturally multidisciplinary, meaning you might have a core skill set, which is data, engineering, analytics, but you have to link up with people who are also domain experts. Like I'm not a medical professional, I'm not a health professional, but I know data well enough so that if I linked up with a health professional, I would be able to help them. And vice versa. The people naman who are usually in the domain expertise are strangely not that accustomed to data, which is odd, no? Because they would have had training in school, no, doing statistics. So now that's an opportunity to bridge the gap. The opportunity here is if you're doing multidisciplinary work in social impact, that can be quite a very fulfilling career. No? I can attest to that. It's a lot of learnings, and you know immediately na if you do it well, you can impact society positively. So if I'm going to group the kind of the top four things I would be looking at, in addition to those AI systems that I mentioned, it would be profiling the beneficiary,
Mhm.
attributing impact, and then for the generative side, creating content and curating content. Lalo na about education, because there's a lot of potential parang gaps just in the understanding of social issues that need to be addressed. Okay, last part. I think we're at the hour. I'll talk about two moral hazards that I see. No? And these are open ended issues that I think will continue to be there, but it's good to be aware of it. Question number one: if no one will pay you money to solve a social problem, when will you start? Diba? That's a big question
That's
because
a
I think
big
there's a lot of
question.
talent who could be making impact in social issues, but they're locked away in high paying jobs. And they're generally ignorant of the power they could do pala. I know this for a fact. I spent more than a decade and a half working in banking and IT. And then later to find out, pwede pala if I bring my skill set out. But it involves a very different parang playing field. And then the other half of this question naman is, if you're already in it and people are paying you to solve problems, won't you make money by never solving them? I think this is a bigger question for NGOs in general. A lot of them survive and depend on continuous donations and infusions. Kaya nga there's like a subset of that sector called social enterprise where you try to make a little bit of money so you can be sustainable, but that often doesn't
That's
work
why
as
a
well
lot of
as it should kasi nga the
NGOs,
moment you become a
foundation
profit
keep
making
popping up
enterprise,
like
it's hard to
mushrooms.
differentiate the profit making from the impact, no? And often one comes at the cost of the other. And then the data ethics questions I always keep bringing up need to
Yes,
be addressed, no? I won't go into them anymore because there's an episode for this. Pero generally, if you're not careful, data can be harmful or data is hard to use. So to summarize, social impact basically is your effect on society. Whether you do something or don't do something, you're making a social impact. Question is whether you're consciously making a positive impact or not. Designing AI systems on social impact can is just one or a couple of combination of interpretation or attribution, design or decisions, planning, and then control and monitoring. And finally, social impact is innately multidisciplinary, so you have to be comfortable crossing silos. Many people are not. In fact, nagkakaturuan nga eh. So
yeah.
things like imposter syndrome, Dunning-Kruger, epistemic trespassing. Academics generally like calling each other out because they don't like people intruding into their turf. But guess what? NGOs are doing the same thing as well. And
Mhm.
then finally, moral hazard. You can twist objectives, no? If you're not careful. Data can hurt you and data can be hard to use. Okay, before we do the Q&A, I want to share first, please, if you're not doing it yet, please follow me on social media in general. So I'm on TikTok, pretty much everywhere. Instagram. I just opened my Threads account. Not really happy with it, pero I'll probably parang interface more on other, especially Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. That's where I'm most active. But I'm going to start doing more videos to populate the other platforms. All of my webinars are uploaded on YouTube. I also have an open invitation to any company or group or association if you want a 1 hour free briefing on AI, which I keep doing. Please contact me. Para lang it's a good start of conversation. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe to YouTube. This is going to be my 7th webinar. No? And then finally, this is going to be launched very soon. Zerolytics, one of my companies, will be doing a special series on design thinking with AI. So this is meant to help individuals or companies who may actually be able to implement something, but they struggle with the ideation. They don't know what to do. And seminars like these, and then itong program namin are meant to unlock that. And with that, that's episode 6 or our 7th webinar. So I'll stop briefly to grab some water. In the meantime, if you're on the live Zoom and you have a question, or if you want to unmute, please do so. Just give me a second. I'm just going to grab some water.
Yes, that was a nice stream, but we'll still wait for the Q&A to be over. So I'll be seeing Doc Ligot
All right.
this coming Saturday
Those who want a copy
at
of the
PUP Santa
slides,
Rosa for
here's the link.
for a
Bit.ly
seminar.
AI for
See you there,
Lunch
Doc.
Impact. I'll paste it here also and on Facebook so people can see. So feel free to give me any. It's case sensitive in case it doesn't work. No? I'll drop it here. Yan. And then sa Facebook na rin. Give me a second while I do so. Let's put a comment in. Thank you for those watching pala sa labas. No? You didn't have to be. Yan. Yeah. I also promised the links to the research or the projects I mentioned. Give me a second. I'm gonna. Bayan, may echo ako. Okay, let's mute that. Yan. Okay, let me drop lang yung links. So there are 3 projects I talked about earlier. Project ADs, infodemiology, and vaccine acceptance. So these are all uploaded online. You can download it for free. And then sa rin. They also have actually they were webinar sponsored by UNDP on this. Sige, if there's no question, I'll run through some of the questions I got during the registration. Let me go through it. Okay. Yan, okay. So some of you asked this when you signed up. No? AI during COVID has generally failed the real world. Bigat naman nun. What do you think were the biggest reasons it failed? Well, actually, remember COVID predated generative AI. I wished we had it when we were going through COVID, but I think it was really data quality. That's the biggest problem.
That's true.
So they're trying to make predictions on the basis of bad data.
They had
Tapos,
bad
I don't know if you
they hid
remember,
the data.
there was this issue on the UK where they were using an Excel sheet or a Google sheet, I think it was Excel, to track cases. Pansin nyo, ganun din si DOH. And then, syempre, at a certain time, it hit the maximum rows of Excel, 1 million plus. And then they thought hindi na nag-grow yung COVID nila. Can you believe that? So on the basis of bad data management, they thought their indicators were positive. Yung pala, they were dropping cases off. So parang pag dumating dun sa maximum rows, nalalaglag na yung iba. That was a major shock for their health service. So I think that was the biggest problem. Data quality, data management. And, just between us in this public webinar, I can tell you the DOH data management could have been much better. But again, the challenge also, it's a crisis. So how can you mobilize something relatively quickly? Pandemic was a scenario on paper in every government office, but no one actually rehearsed it the same way we rehearse fire drills and floods. So talagang di tayo handa. Hopefully in the next, and knock on wood, there won't be another one. So hopefully, if it does happen, we are more ready. How can AI-driven technology contribute to accelerating the widespread adoption of renewable energy? Mas naputol. Okay, in any social impact, I won't necessarily address renewables per se. There's usually 3 areas of improvement agad. Number 1, awareness and education. AI can make a big deal there. No? I would say with just a few exceptions, other than the usual suspects like climate and kahit nga human rights, most people are not even aware of these of these opportunities or challenges. So just doing more education content. Like you look back to the episode on education, use the AI to generate an online course, and then just share it. No, there's a big opportunity there. So that's number one. Number two, operational. I mentioned earlier, yung operational framework for any NGO can immediately be improved. No? I'll go back to that slide on AI systems, this one. So look through these four things that can immediately be implemented, let's say for renewable energy and any aspect. No? If you're able to divine an opportunity there, then you can already propose a project agad. That's basic. No? You can get to that. No? Ano pa ba? The third, okay, if you already have awareness, you already have operations, then the next big thing is, can you use AI for not just forecasting, but be intelligent enough to react to a situation? Like the fight against disinformation continues to rage, no? And the reason is it's possible kasi to generate fake news using the AI, pero it's harder to detect. Now, so for renewables, automation na talaga yung next step dyan. How do you automate many systems, many industries to prioritize renewable energy? No? So, I mean, those are just top of the head. If you're into renewable energy talaga, I'm sure there's a lot of things that can be implemented even within, let's say, a company or an industry. Pero in terms of adoption, yun, communication, education, automation. How can AI be leveraged to address the most pressing social and environmental challenges? Well, as I said, come up with a theory of change. No, like when we did Sparta, the problem was so big. How do you solve it? One step at a time. Pero defining those steps in a logical manner, usually hard for typical NGO. The reason is everyone wants to jump to action mode agad and without studying the problem. And then oppositely, you have too much research being done without action on the research. So yung middle ground yung kulang. Can you marry research and action? Like in Project ADs, if I jump back to that slide,
Research and
we
action
didn't
should go
do
hand in
too
hand.
much preliminary research anymore. The reason for that was there was already a lot of research, like itong social media and dengue. Somebody did a paper on that already. And then yung climate and dengue, somebody did a paper on that already. And finally, yung remote sensing the mosquito hotspot, there was actually a group on Facebook, yung grupo ni na Wilson Chua who were doing it. So I said, okay, these things are happening. Why don't we just bring them all together in one solution? And that's what birthed the project. Pero yun na nga, the funny part is, despite that, hindi pa rin in-adopt ni DOH. So our opportunity now was, let's talk to the ones who
Disappointing.
care about it. No? So NASA referred us to GEO referred us to DPG. DPG is now bringing us to UNICEF. And mangyayari pa dyan, baka mauna pa yung other countries to implement our system. And then maybe the DOH will notice it. No?
Yeah.
Something as innocuous as
It's
machine
typical.
learning translation exhibits gender bias. Yeah, I think I haven't clicked on this yet, no, but there's a lot of bias in existing data. So that's also a challenge if you're using the big data component. In the same way, if you do surveys, you'll have a bias. The solution there naman is you can't eliminate bias at all, but you have to parang address to parang two levels of bias. I talked about this dun sa ethics episode. Number one, is your sample of data reflective of reality? Kasi minsan, the sample itself already is a bias. And then even if it is reflective of reality, reality is also biased. So are you now able to adequately mitigate or counter a bias without being a hegemon? No? And that's the second part is harder. Kasi if you say, okay, we need to address representation of women in technology. Good. But now it can easily become prioritizing women only, and you now are now biased towards women. So that's the problem naman with that movement. You have a lot of tokenism that favors women. I'm just using that as an example. So oftentimes, even if you solve the sampling bias, you're not able to address kind of the latter part when you make an intervention. And the only way to do that is to have many stakeholders who can give you opinions para you don't fall into that latter category. How can AI contribute to being more effective and efficient resource allocation decision making? Yun na nga. So those four use cases I said, do you need help with attribution? Do you need help with planning, with monitoring, or decision making, or a combination of the four? And then finally, what are the milestones to watch? Well, the SDGs provide a good parang overarching framework, but I think you need to go further than that. No, you need to establish a theory of change that could be connected to the SDGs. That's easier said than done. Okay, sige, let's read the chat. So ano ba yung meron dito? Si Josh, I attended the AI Summit last month. You're the moderator. You asked for availability of data in public, but then they answered based on data privacy. So, yun nga yeah, you mentioned data masking. I don't think someone has adequately parang suggested that you can use generative AI to create synthetic data that has the same distribution as real data. So why is that an issue or important? Kasi nga, with data privacy, the problem is if you can identify individuals, sira na yung privacy
Sira
nila.
na yung privacy
But
doon.
then you need that data to analyze and create strategies. So you can use autoencoders, for example, to convert PII data set into kind of an anonymized data set. So the individual records are not traceable to anyone anymore. But as a whole, the distribution of the data set mimics the original. No? Parang encryption na hindi. That's actually an opportunity for privacy. Pero yun na nga, since it relies on machine learning and deep learning, I think the bottom line there is the privacy sector doesn't have enough expertise to do it. So that's an opportunity for those who know it to suggest it. Are there any policy regulation in place to enable government to contribute? Wala. Well, freedom of information is one. Pero FOI is not open data. Open data should be proactive, open na agad.
Yes.
FOI is more reactive. Magiging open na siya once it's shared. And then FOI doesn't allow you also to insist. So if they say no, we can't share it, wala ka na magagawa. Okay, Tuob in Luzon is Suob. Okay, good to know. Ano pa ba? Any other questions? This is an insightful session. Thank you so much. Yep, thanks for attending, Julius. I hope this opens your mind. Actually, this talk is not new. I've given a variation of this talk even before, pero I think putting it in the AI for Lunch playlist can at least help people find it easier. I actually have quite a lot of talks that I want to recycle na ngayon and start sharing openly. And we're not even at the commercial part yet. We're looking at the non-commercial. Inuhuli ko yon because everyone can probably find a version of marketing analytics, operations analytics, etc. elsewhere. Pero baka they're not understanding it well enough. So eventually we'll probably get there. But at least for the topics that are close to my heart, dito tayo. Okay, wait. What about Facebook? Is there anyone on Facebook that has a question? Let's find out. Okay. Simar, we hope to invite you in future sessions. Yeah, just message me, no? Okay, Jericho. Since data can harm people, do you think analytics jobs would be a licensed profession? What could be the implications? No? So sabi niya, once read, the data scientist should not be licensed. So okay, that's a regulatory question. I think if you look at analogs in other professions, may licensing talaga. Like you can't build a building without a building permit, and you can't be an architect without a license. Or some medical profession, you can't issue prescriptions if you're not a doctor, and you can't serve a prescription if you're not a pharmacist. So generally, you will like to license something that can be abused and has harmful implications. So does data fall in that category? Yes. Now the question is, what part of that data profession should be licensed? Parang sa analogy ko sa kotse. You can be a mechanic or a driver, but only drivers are licensed, pansin nyo? Why? Because drivers can kill people if they drive the wrong way or they drive drunk. And cars have to be registered. But mechanics, not necessarily. You can be a mechanic with or without a license. So I think there needs to be some sort of a definition of jobs or roles. Now, without a particular permit, you can't do it. And my easy suggestion, it's not final yet, is we should probably license implementation of projects, but not research. So research should be free for all, so you can keep at pace with the global developments and innovate. But then if you want to implement an AI project in a government institution or a private sector institution, you go through due diligence, no? And that's what standards like ISO can help with, no? Diba, may mga ISO standards for quality, information security, risk management. So these are more like prescriptions rather than actual parang regulation, meaning if you are an ISO 9001 certified manufacturer, that means you have a high standard of quality, and that might allow you to be a supplier to certain companies who might require the ISO standard. But if you're not qualified, you're not part of the ISO standard, it doesn't mean you're being punished. Pero yun na nga, your opportunities are limited. So baka ganun yung approach. At least that's one direction that I would suggest. Okay, mukhang yun na yun, no? Sige, so, well, first, I want to thank everyone for attending. I know Saturdays are sacred, but I feel that overall this is a better compromise. I don't know if I want to try a different time slot later on. Like some people are suggesting nighttime. Although I have been invited to other types of activities, to share. Like last Saturday, I believe I was invited to a Twitter space. That went very well kasi Q&A style siya. So baka I might do that more regularly, like host a Twitter space every,
We could do a
every
Twitter space,
evening.
right?
And then, to give everyone a heads up, I've started having conversations with people. So in addition to this webinar, I'll start airing some of those conversations. I used to do a lot of those back in 2020, under data ethics, yung mga conversations. I might re-air some of those. But syempre, that was before generative AI. So the conversations I've been doing now are more related to generative AI and what other people are doing about it. So I interviewed, professors, AI safety researchers. I also want to start interviewing developers para you can see what they're doing. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I might air that probably on a weekday ng gabi, and then do it regularly. I'm just accumulating enough conversations so I can make a new. Is AI for lunch on podcast? It's not on Spotify yet. I don't know kasi it's quite long. It's about an hour. But what I'll do is probably cut it up into smaller chunks and then upload it on Spotify. Kasi ang dami na eh. Each of these episodes can easily be 2 or 3 podcasts sa Spotify. So I'll do that. All right. Sige. Any other questions on Zoom? Wala na. Okay, so if that's the case, I want to thank everyone for attending. The links are in either on Facebook or here. Please feel free to download, and if you want a copy of the slides, please fill up the survey. So until then, thank you very much.
Doc.
AI for lunch. Stay tuned for the next episode next Saturday.
That was a very cool, informative stream. And if you want more of Doc Ligot's materials, just follow him on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Yeah, and subscribe to my channel there at the bottom at Cutterhole 5 in YouTube. So that's it for today, and peace. I'm out of here.
killing people?
They look alive to me.
Because I saved them.
Well, that's why I waited until you were there. I got the information I needed. No one died. I did it your way.
He does have a point.
I know it got lost in all the confusion, but we still have some issues to settle here. There are only heroes and there are villains.
You think yourself a hero, but you would let these criminals go free.
Heroes don't kill people.
Well, I do.